Good afternoon from a very hot London, and welcome to today's FS Club webinar, Influence Alpha, Shaping Apex Decision-Making in Government. In a world of increasingly activist states, government decisions matter. What insights do we have into apex decision-making in government? Apex decisions are level 1 decisions that can be consequential for business and society. And today, Professor Alexander Evans from the London School of Economics will be sharing his insights into apex decision-making as he explores how the British, American and UN systems operate. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Alexander Evans, OBE. Professor Evans teaches public policy and technology at the LSE and directs the MPA in data science for public policy. A career member of HM Diplomatic Service, he has worked in 10 Downing Street, the Obama administration State Department, and headed the UN Security Council's Daesh, Al-Qaeda and Taliban expert missions. Among his UK government roles, he has been Strategy Director in the Cabinet Office, Cyber Director in the Foreign Office, and Deputy and Acting High Commissioner to India and briefly Pakistan. So he is incredibly well placed to brief us on apex decision-making today. If we haven't met virtually or in person, I'm Charlotte Dorbrashley and I manage the FS Club here at ZN. I'd like to warmly acknowledge our very generous sponsors who enable us to continue to bring you a wide range of thought-provoking content across finance, technology, economics and politics. We'll be recording this session and it will be available to watch on our website within 48 hours along with the slide deck, and we'll also be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after the presentation. So please use the GoToWebinar chat facility to send your questions in to me early and then I can feed them into the conversation. Now, without any further ado, over to you, Professor.
Charlotte, thank you very much indeed, and thanks all for joining. I'm going to put up some slides because not only are you sacrificing an afternoon on a sunny day, you're sacrificing to another PowerPoint presentation. I hope that's all up and working. So look, thanks very much for joining. If you're joining looking for the secret heart of the clock on how to influence decision making, I'm afraid I haven't got a BuzzFeed list or a TED talk or a set of answers for that. But I wanted to share some thoughts on the research and teaching that we do around apex decision making. What do we mean by that? It's really looking at level 1 decision making in government. So looking at cabinet level and a small cluster of people out with that, including special advisors, including some officials, but not necessarily extending much beyond that. So my first sort of perhaps central question is, how does strategic decision making work in government, and how can it be shaped? Oops, sorry, let me see if that comes back in. So this talk suggests it's largely about people, but not very many people. Ideas, and I think ideas are more important than we sometimes give them credit for. We're often thinking about trying to shape decisions about policy or regulation, when actually the wider idea may have greater shaping force. Influence, which of course is not the same thing as access, and timing. And it recognises that apex decision-making, the small in-group that makes major government decisions, is more about court than cabinet. Even if the cultures of decision-making may vary by principles and group dynamics. What do I mean by court rather than cabinet? I think it's really tempting to look at formal structures, to look at hardwiring, but as all of us would know from whichever organisations we've worked with or in, whether you're talking about working in a bank or an insurance company, a management consultancy, a non-profit, a regulator, or a bit of government, each organisation tends to be framed as much by the prevailing cultural norms and by informal networks as by who's technically on the executive committee, who actually attends board, who is in a particular profit and loss leadership role or in a strategic leadership role. And one of the central arguments I would make is actually perhaps somewhat an argument for blending the qualitative with the quantitative. That may sound eccentric coming from the LSE, but remember the LSE is the London School of Economics and Political Science. Open brackets, we have anthropologists and historians here too, close brackets. So biographies really matter, and biographies matter including age. And to give an example of that, you'll see here on the left just a citation from a bit of research in 2005 that suggests that older leaders in very personalized regimes, Exhibit A, Vladimir Putin, are more likely to initiate and escalate militarized disputes. So there is actually an impact that the nature of an individual in that decision-making role will have that isn't there on the day. It's there as an accretion and accumulation of what they've had through their life and organizational biography. So your attitude towards financial risk might be very different if you went through through any particular financial crisis. Your attitude towards profit and loss may be different if you've gone through a buoyant period when you're getting a great deal. And equally in government, a lot of government principles are heavily shaped by, in particular, crisis points and reference points that shape not just their time in office, but the longer term period through which they've been politically and socially active as adults. So let me give a couple of examples of that. In defence and security, a lot of the framing for 1990s and 2000s policy was of a post-Cold War or a Cold War cusp generation, where the Cold War was the original reference point, but the 90s became the new reference point. And the path dependency around that suggested that things might roughly feel similar to how they'd been in the 1990s. That's evidently not turned out to be true. The path dependency for people coming into the 1950s in British government decision-making or American decision-making was anchored through World War II, which shaped a very different set of learnings and lessons and biographical inputs. The second thing is how systems actually work. On the left here is a photograph I took in a whiskey company in Scotland. Other good whiskey companies are available, of course, but this is a company that names all its blends differently. And I would argue that along with the central bottle that you see here, conversations and ruminations, but actually a lot of the nature of decision making is not shaped by existing plans or policy development or long-range strategies, but it's actually developed much more in adhocracy rather than democracy. And that adhocracy is triggered by events, it's triggered by crises, which very much shape decision-making, and it may be moved by the changing moods or patterns or issues of the day. And informal networks of decision-making may be much more important to decision-making than the formal. So it's less about the cabinet meeting, just as all of us who've been to or participate in committees and governance, a lot of the business is not in the room. So to paraphrase Hamilton, if you want to be in the room where it happens, if you really want to shape the room where it happens, you probably want to be engaged with that group of people in advance of the day, in advance of a decision, not on the day itself. And so you see two other bottles here, roll with the punches, that's the crisis element, and electrochemistry, which probably speaks a little bit to the challenge of divining how government actually works. The second thing I want to speak about briefly is just time, and thinking long matters in government, and it's really difficult. All governments, I would argue, both democracies and authoritarian states, true of my experience in the UK, US and UN systems, aren't very good at thinking long. They're not very good at drawing on the relevant expertise, or escaping being in the mode of fighting the last war, sort of having as a reference point the last big thing rather than the next big thing. And many apex decision makers lack time for reflection. And this is a core theme of this book by Richard Neustadt and Ernest May. It's still a classic, the uses of history for decision makers. And just as many organizations struggle with institutional memory, who knows what the prehistory was even 15 years ago of the organization you work for now. In government, there is often quite a short-term institutional memory of policy, even if policies, a policy framework has been around for decades or longer. I think it's quite useful to think about cross-cultural reference points here. Maybe some people on this call will be or will have been parents of under 5-year-olds. There's a glorious Norwegian word for this, tidsklemma, which literally means time squeeze. And it's used to explain why people are stressed, miss things, and have no time. And I would argue that public policy and apex decision making is about tidsklemma on a regular basis, but it comes sometimes with greater consequences as a result. And that's not just the course of a decision-making day for a minister in the UK or for a member of the Principals Committee, a member of a cabinet in the United States, but it's the constant stream of pre and post work represented here by a typical Secretary of State red box. So the challenge of having a range of decisions that you have to make late in the evening, early in the morning, the inability often of a system that wants that level 1 apex attention, but it isn't always very good at discriminating either in what should actually go up to that level and what can be dealt with at a level 2 or level 3 in government, or indeed in compressing advice, analysis, requests for decisions into a really lucid short form that is punchy enough to ease decision making along the way. And here there is a truism, at least about the British and the American systems, which is there tends to be a greater favour to words than numbers, and probably numbers over data. So I think it's a very welcome focus now increasingly on data analytics and data science. I would say that, wouldn't I, Gov, as somebody who runs a data science and public policy masters in public administration. But in essence, you have a system and an advisory culture that is framed towards the written word. And yet again, if you flash back to how we might individually prefer to make decisions, some of us are more visual, some of us are more numbers based, some of us are more words based in terms of our advice. Some of us prefer to sit in a room and talk over advice rather than receive written advice. I want to briefly dwell on the idea of a court rather than cabinet. And this, I think, would find an echo in the lived ethnographic experience of most people in organisations. Who matters in most organisations? Is it really the people on the organogram at the top, or is it a cluster of people who have access or influence on those at the top? And I would argue it's often the latter. Whose advice is actually listened to? Gatekeepers are really important. You know, it's tempting to think of gatekeepers as second order characters in the court, but actually a principal private secretary, a PPS or chief of staff in non-UK parlance, to a minister is probably the official who spends most time with that minister day to day, week to week, even more than some of the special advisors, who will not necessarily always be present for every meeting or involved in every issue. You know, I think back to a friend of mine who was the chief of staff to the chief executive and then the chair of Citigroup globally. And what you had, if you like, was that top floor of the Citigroup HQ, where the chief of staff was present, as was the chair, as was the chief exec, and actually a range of the level ones in Citi sat on the floor below. So chiefs of staff, PPSs, these principal private secretaries often matter a great deal. But part of understanding a court is also recognizing that there are a lot of people in the court who claim to have influence, who claim to be senior and have voice, but actually don't necessarily have a great deal. Now, it's very rare, you know, when people reach their anecdotage, may retire or are pushed out or suffer from that joyous or humiliating career-ending incident. The temptation in memoir writing or the retrospectoscope is to exaggerate how much influence or power you had on a principle. So I like this novel. This is Ian Pearce, an instance of a finger post, where it just has one, you know, the principal narrator reflecting on the fact that he didn't find it displeasing to be have a period away from the court, because actually in the entire country, fewer than half a dozen people have true power. The rest are governed in one way or another. And I had more than sufficient contact with those who are truly of significance. So the ability to actually map, you know, power effectively decision influence alpha, if you like, within organizations is, I would argue, an exercise of ethnography and political insight, increasingly important in a world where the state is getting more activist and larger, and is becoming, there's a tendency back towards more interventionist states as well. Is strategic influence possible against this backdrop? One could argue that in a US or other framework where you have more political appointees, more porosity coming in, actually you have somebody who might have come in from being a chief exec of a credit ratings agency and may end up in a position in the Treasury in the United States. Or you have somebody who's been out in the private sector and has actually done something around profit and loss rather than regulatory or public affairs or government affairs, and then might come into government. We're a much more closed shop in the UK system. So let me just canter through I think some of the core precepts. And again, these are not going to be particularly novel. The menu always includes direct and indirect routes, lobbying, but I think risk that inputs end up digested at mid-level. There can be an awful lot of attentive activity that promises and claims to reach apex decision makers or people very close to them. And actually a lot of that activity, I think, can be sort of demonstration investment, but with the emphasis on demonstration rather than investment. What is clear is that access to core decision makers, which is usually the Prime Minister, Secretaries of State, some SPAD, some special advisors, who particularly the policy special advisors to Secretaries of State, and some officials, but I would say that probably fairly sparingly, is important when you're looking at trying to influence that key ultimate decision. But actually, in terms of direct influence, shaping principles before they reach high office is often more effective, I think, as a vehicle to shape their worldview, shape their preferences, shape how they might reach out to others for evidence, for advice, for feedback, and how they might respond to some of that advice as well. And clearly the indirect tools are important too, highbrow mass media. Now, why do I put both in there? Partly it's recognizing that I think a really good piece in The Economist or the Financial Times is often quite carefully digested by apex decision makers, and is much more likely to be digested than a long form policy memo or white paper. But equally, something that is gripping, that has sort of tabloid grip, that sort of Daily Mail headline, the way to encapsulate something, whether that's around some of the debates right now around the ULEZ in London, or some of the debates around how poll tax has been characterised, or how the cost of living crisis has been characterised. Finding a kind of, if you finding a meme or a brand around this mattered even in a pre-social media age, and it matters ever more in a social media age. And of course, the think tanks and commentariat. But recognizing again that think tank and commentariat space is often quite small. I've worked in a range of it, both in the UK and the US. And there's a temptation there to exaggerate reach and impact. Because if the metric, it's tricky finding metrics that properly measure the think tank space or the commentariat space. What are you measuring? Are you measuring the number of readers, the reach, who turns up to events, volume of media coverage? And these are often used as proxy measures for influence. But you might have a think tank that has relatively little media coverage, but actually has really quite significant influence and reach on 2 or 3 principles in that apex decision-making community. But I want to also focus on the thing that's often missed out. I think the temptation is to focus on what one might call the West Wing. The West Wing is where it all happens, right? The West Wing is 10 Downing Street. It's the White House. It's a minister's office. It's the cabinet table. But actually, the East Wing is where most policies and decisions get implemented. The East Wing is what's the machinery of government that's going to follow through on making sure that a new regulation is operationalized in a particular way, making sure that a new investment flows in a particular way. And one of the lessons of government writ large in the UK, and I think this is probably true of other governments too, is there's a long and inglorious track record of non-implementation. So even taking an administration that was as radical as the Thatcher administration in the early 1980s, a detailed National Audit Office set of reports in the mid-80s suggested that there was sort of certainly a failure rate of about 40% against intended policies for that government. And I would suggest, at least for most governments, you could probably do a reasonably similar exercise with at least declassified or publicly released materials. So if you really want to have influence on the decision, it's not just about decision, it's about the follow through and the implementation, and that's about technical and policy inputs going in at mid-level. That's where the grade 7 or the PS14 in the US terms, mid-level engagement, is super critical. As a course is shaping for parliamentary time, not much use having a great idea if you can't get the time in Parliament to actually initiate the primary or secondary legislation that you need to do things. And I would also argue that engaging with contrary opinions or perspectives in the cacophony of a public policy debate, having, getting in early to those who have different views, I think is a productive enterprise rather than a disruptive one. And finally, this sense of patience and persistence. It's really challenging if you're pursuing short-term goals around tax and regulation or investment policy. It requires applied focus on longer-term issues, which are often harder because political and bureaucratic dynamics, and that's both civil servants and politicians, tend to be kind of short-term by default. And here, sustained and non-transactional relationships over time really help, and not always mediated by lobbyists or public affairs executives. As does good branding, as I said, what's a gripping title or story around the proposed new policy. And finally, there is one advantage that people can draw on, which is the fact that there is an infectious disease in almost all governments, but certainly in democracies, called initiativitis. And it's the hunt for new announceables, for new signature policies that can help frame the wider effort of governments to engage with voters and their publics. And that means there is often appetite for something new against a system that is not always very good at innovation or delivering novelty. And that, I would argue, is another space where actually influence alpha can be particularly effective, not just on a change of government, but during the constant nature of governments as well. So perhaps I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Professor. That was fascinating. Thinking of all of the range you said of influences, and obviously culture, and you mentioned even, age of leaders and their background, makes a significant contribution to that. What is the difference between democratic and non-democratic governments in apex decision making?
So I think actually, if you look at non-democratic governments, and a lot of my work is focused on that too. They're equally as bad at the long term as democratic governments. So I think there's sometimes a bit of a populist mythology that authoritarian states don't have to worry about public opinion; they do long-term policy better. The difference, though, is they have even weaker feedback loops. They have very little or no accountability, and they still have that inherent bias towards short-termism for apex decision makers. But I think what's interesting is the point of continuity across most systems, and that is basically this dominance of informal networks, informal influences of decision making that is shaped by that. And in fact, what's interesting is many societies have a word for that. The Russians have blat, which means pull. The Chinese have guanxi, which means connections. Pakistanis have safarish, which means recommendation. So stepping back, we tend to be tempted into this idea that we have formalized decision-making in Western democracies. And actually, that focus on excessive structures and formalization misreads not a corrupt nature of intricate informal networks, but more the fact that informal networks, the informal is normal and it normally trumps the formal.
Interesting. Moving on to the civil service, Graham Elliott has asked, shouldn't an effective civil service provide the long view, and shouldn't the culture cause politicians to acquire that of the civil service?
So look, I mean, I think that I personally teach anticipatory policy making at the LSE. I think long range policy making is needed now more than ever. I do think there's a role there for the civil service, but a chunk of it is it's back to Hamilton again. Are you going to be in the room where it happens if you're presenting the study on the next 25 years of local transport infrastructure, or are you going to be in the room where it happens when you're presenting a decision about what should we do next on the concrete challenge in schools in the UK? So I think what almost inevitably happens is you end up with apex decision-making fora where the urgent and the immediate crowds out the long term. There is, I think, a properly kind of engaged effort in government to try and bake in some of that longer term thinking. So you have foresight communities, you have efforts to develop strategies, rather like the integrated review on foreign policy, on which I was a part, or Tony Blair's earlier foreign policy strategy on which I worked. But the challenge is those documents, they do have a shaping influence, but they don't necessarily have a week-to-week or day-to-day effect on decision making. And what there's often been a dissonance around, again, across multiple governments, this is not exclusive to the UK, is connecting the money with decision making. And if you like, tracking consequential effects of policy over time. Reading National Audit Office reports, or sort of, learning, if you like, the deep internal history of pensions policy in the UK tends to be the preserve of academics or kind of wonks who will speak on Bloomberg rather than people in the system itself. And there's a very poor short-term memory system in government.
So going on to these informal channels that influence decisions, especially in Western governments, have there been movements to change this? To sort of remove, limit the power really of the informal factors, networks.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's the conversation that dare not speak its name, because let's face it, for most of us, human beings tend to engage in informal connections as well as formal discussions. And if we were to take any decision that we've made, a decision to take a particular job or not, to do a certain degree or not, to live with a particular partner or not, we will all have stories that we tell about how we made those decisions. Those stories don't always correspond with how the decisions were actually made by us. There's sort of a black box that's quite difficult to read about how we make decisions. So I just think there's something here where the effort to formalize can help. The area where it's probably been most successful is in terms of intelligence and national security analysis or terrorism risk, where the importance of having impartial assessments are so key that there has been structural reform to try and strengthen those. But I think that becomes much more difficult when you're talking about the regular kind of business of policy decisions, big or medium-sized in government.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And what about differences like, we touched on age and that, but what about women-led governments and things like that?
Well, I don't know the literature well enough probably to comment across the field on academic stuff on it, but I would suggest this. There's a pretty established corpus of evidence that shows that men interrupt in meetings most of the time, and it's pretty normalized. And so for just taking a level one who is not the Prime Minister, if you're a cabinet secretary, are you likely to interrupt as much as a male colleague without that necessarily being viewed as counterproductive to making your case? Are you likely to be more long term? I would argue that I'd be skeptical if there was a gender difference around long term thinking, but there may be. I don't know whether research is trying to measure that. But in terms of female leadership, obviously, again, you've got a smaller group of case studies to work from. A Margaret Thatcher is not the same as a Liz Truss or a Theresa May. So I think it becomes it's easy to extrapolate from an individual. I worked for Richard Holbrooke and Hillary Clinton in the State Department in the first Obama administration. So I could talk about Hillary Clinton, but that's not going to then generalize about female leaders writ large.
It seems like the short-termism has created a lot of the problems that the UK is facing at the moment, because it's, with COVID and Brexit, it's going from one crisis to another. And I was, thinking that, especially coming from New Zealand, where we have a 3-year term, it's very hard for politicians to focus on the long term, having to be campaigning every 3 years. But the UK government term is a lot longer, but it doesn't seem to have changed that. Are there what are the solutions apart from having a longer term, which I'm sure the public wouldn't be happy with?
Look, so as I said, I think at the start, I don't think there's necessarily a magic bullet for, either for influence or for improving long-term decision-making in government. I had fun in the last year and a bit trawling through all the discussions of pension policy in the UK cabinet since the 1920s. And since the 1950s, there's been a discussion about raising the retirement age from 65 to 67. Since the 1950s. But it's in the too difficult box most of the time. I think there are a range of initiatives that have been tried in different spaces. One is to try and pursue is there a bipartisan framework for decision making on something that is relatively defanged in political terms. So not around sort of a culture wars issue, but for example, is there something that one could do around long-term financing of mortgages, where things might feel different? So I'm very encouraged today, given I normally do gloom. I'm very encouraged today that there's been, I think, regulatory clearance for the first offer on full life fixed term mortgages in the UK. Now, an interesting question about what that means, but question mark, can that kind of offer help change the nature of affordability and predictability in the mortgage market for people struggling to get on the housing ladder in a admittedly house prices are going down, but in an environment where house prices are still out of reach for many people, especially in London. Some jurisdictions have created futures commissioners. Wales, for example. I think there's very mixed views about how effective some of that has been. And even when you create sort of foresight units or strategy discussions, the challenge a little bit is what's the so what? Because if you don't have a decision attached to a discussion, what you end up with is a lovely kind of breakfast discussion or a kind of after dinner discussion. AI, what does it mean for our society? But are you actually then trying to shape a decision off the back of it? So I would argue one way to improve things is to better connect a lot of that work that's done, which is not sort of deep academic research necessarily. It's applied policy thinking, applied long-term thinking, but to what extent can you connect some of those communities more effectively with decision makers with you want to bring in somebody again with that sort of P&L or focused delivery focus to think about how do you translate that into what does that mean for decisions, when, what, where, how.
Yeah, the cross-party collaboration is key there, and it is quite concerning with the increase in culture wars that will move away from that. Dan Feeney has asked, are there too many spads and media minders in UK politics?
So Dan, it's a question that comes up pretty regularly. I would say I'm not particularly persuaded that's true. The SPAD numbers have oscillated between, I think, roughly 100 or so up to, I think they maxed out at maybe 140, 145. If you break that down, that's 140 in a wider public service of more than 400,000. That's a pretty tiny number. You break it down further, you've probably got 3 overlapping communities within those special advisors. You've got people who are actually doing substantive policy advice. So effectively providing a more politicized version of what a civil servant would do around, what should you do about the challenge of the train network in the UK with potentially a declining income base because of working from home or working remotely. You've then got the media handlers who are often quite the dominant group in some ways. If you start to look at a breakdown of SPADs and what they're actually doing, they're there to watch, they're there as much to work for their principles or to work for their political party as they are to work for a wider government. And then you've got people who are doing party liaison and political party engagement, which tends to be quite a small number of SPADs. I wouldn't want to see, I've worked in a US system where there's a lot more political appointees. I wouldn't want to see a system where the upper strata of government as a whole was occupied by political appointees, because I think it would lend itself to actually much greater hyper-partisanship, and you run the risk of also a much deeper well of sort of individualized patronage from ministers. But I'm quite sympathetic to the argument of opening up and having a much more porous senior civil service in the UK. At the moment, the civil service feels a little bit like you get your golden ticket to get in, and then you sort of you busily seal the windows to make sure that nobody else can get in after you. And I'm a big fan, even if it disadvantages existing civil servants. I'm a big fan of trying to encourage much more porosity, hybridity, people shifting in and out. You do need to guard against conflicts of interest. I've left government, but I can't lobby the government, for example, on issues linked to LSE, which is entirely reasonable and proper, and that's one of the conditions of me moving here to be a professor. But I would be thumbs down for much more politicization, thumbs up for much more porosity. And does 140 or so feel too many? I'm not sure it does. I think it becomes an excessive focus of a sort of the Westminster bubble to see who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out. But against a wider cohort of people who are around, that's quite a small number.
Is that number of 140 been pretty steady over the decades, or has it been increasing?
No, it increased. I mean, I think actually, if this is from memory, there's a very good study by Andrew Blick based on his PhD on special advisors. But I think the biggest lift was in the major government. Actually, it was the assumption is it was always Thatcher government that led to a big spike. I think a lot more of it spiked in the 1990s, and then effectively has been pretty sustained ever since. Now, some of those individuals obviously have more, are better known public figures than others by virtue of, are you the kind of, whether you take Dom Cummins or you take Peter Mandelson, whoever it might be, you've got figures, or Alistair Campbell, you've got figures who are much more visible and much more known. But it's still, if you break that down and then look at who's doing policy advice as distinct from press and spin doctoring, it's a relatively small number of people. And there is also an argument that you want, it's not unhelpful to have both that professional, detached, and one would hope impartial and evidence-based civil service advice, but also sometimes that being going in parallel with slightly more politicized advice, again, whether you've got a government that's of the left or the right.
Yeah. Moving now on to American politics, Sam has said, given the upheaval in America over the last few years, what has been the most noticeable change in diplomacy between the UK and the US, and has this affected strategic decision-making in the UK government?
Look, I mean, you would expect me to say this, wouldn't you, Gov? But I mean, I think the US-UK relationship works pretty effectively at many levels, and it does so because there's a lot of muscle memory. So, my entire career in the Foreign Office, I'd worked with American counterparts. I also, lived in the States. I worked in the State Department. I went to, I did a mid-career program in the States. So there's kind of, I think, a comfort level, and that also exists, Charlotte, with I think, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. But it's very strongly present with the US. But clearly, the US, politics is getting into a more volatile space in the United States. The election that the presidential election that comes next in the US will be deeply consequential for the pathways and choices of the United States. But diplomacy is about engaging with the governments in power and making sure that you keep ties with oppositions. And in that way, diplomacy is not altogether different to all forms of engagement with government.
Yeah, that's true. We've had a few comments coming in just saying that it's been a very interesting discussion, so thank you for that. I think we're almost out of time. So once again, thank you very much, Professor, for sharing your time and knowledge with us. I think we'll all go back and start thinking what are the factors influencing our decisions in work and home life from now on. And also thank you to the audience for logging in and contributing to the discussion today. And of course, our sponsors who make these webinars possible. Don't forget to check out the forthcoming events on our website. We've got lots of more diverse webinars coming up. And if you are in London next week, why not come along to our autumn mixer, which will be at the Bank of China on Thursday. You can register for that on our website. It would be great to meet some of you in person. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.